Hey all, and welcome back to the Master Series with Rebelle. I'm Daniel Ibanez, and this month we're going to cover Frank Frazetta and John Harris. John Harris is the spaceships over here, and Frank Frazetta is these kind of epic figures, as you can see in these epic backgrounds. These are two amazing artists who work traditionally. John Harris, still working living artist, works in oil pastels and then oil paints, and then Frank Frazetta, ink, pencil, and oil paint. The Frazetta estate is still very vibrant, selling his work, copies, illustrations, originals, whatever. You can go find them at San Diego Comic-Con. You can go to their website. You can go on this very active Instagram page. John Harris is still a working artist, contributing new work to the world all the time. Both of them are incredibly important. Over the last, 5 decades. It's just been a really wonderful inspiration to me personally. And so I wanted to start with those guys today. We're kind of in a back to school mode, and makes me think of me as a school age artist. And there's probably, these two guys were some of the most important artists to me of that age of my life. And so I wanted to make sure and do something to honor them. To get started, we're actually going to look at John Harris first. And so I'm going to wipe out these little reference images. I love in Rebelle that it's so easy to add and subtract reference images from your document. Just hit the little X here. In my reference images tab, I can see that I can just pop them in and out just like that. Or I can do that here if I want to. It's very, very nice, very simple. And I love the ability to have a whole library of references and inspiration images just tucked right into that little folder, basically. It keeps things really focused, right? Because if I have to go outside of the app to go build like a mood board, that's a waste of time to me. So here I can basically have the mood board built right in. So I love that. Something else I wanted to point out real quick is that John Harris uses pastels. Pastels are a great way to work. Whether you're a plein air artist or someone doing illustrations for books, magazines, whatever, pastels are very, very strong tool. Like they have, a really good impact. And I think I wanted to talk about that a little bit with John Harris, because Rebelle has great pastels. And I love, you have some nice brush heads here, and then some different ones that you can go into with the oil pastels, the texture brushes, and so on. But you can go ahead and add to all these. You can change all these. There's so much we can do to go beyond the default settings in Rebelle. But for today, we're just going to start with the basics and look at this little monolith that I was sketching. I'm just color referencing exactly off of the reference picture, which for the purposes of this demo, is just going to help kind of escalate what I'm trying to do, just speed it up. If you're going to try and draw something and make it look kind of realistic, right? You just, whether it's a garden wall or a skyscraper or whatever it is, if you want to make something kind of have that impact of realism, there's a really simple technique for that. And so if you've got something like this, like a geometric shape like this, or maybe the flat plane of a wing, maybe a fuselage of some craft or whatever, doesn't matter what it is, but you're going to have some things happening here that I want to point out. So let me grab this little wax pencil, darker brush here, is that you want to have a value shift or a color temperature shift going this way across your geometry, and then also this way across your geometry. And so you can see here that things are getting a little kind of cooler and grayer down here, a little, maybe a little pinker up here. And then you also have, let me back that out. Oops, got a little too far. But then you also have a shift going this direction. And all it takes is just a tiny, subtle little shift in the tones, in the temperature, just to give that sense of, oh, this is a real object in space. And we know that the reason why that is let's say, for example, let's say you've got like a little garden wall here, and you've got like, it's like a planter or whatever, and you got grass growing up against it here. Well, like whatever that wall is made out of, let's say it's some kind of a stucco or something like that, you're going to get more bounce light from the green of the grass into the lower part of that wall here. And then you're going to have less of that green up in the top part of it, right? So you might have the local color. Let's say the local color is kind of like some kind of beigey tan color like this, right? Whoops. Sort of a beige kind of like cream color like that. But then you've got the green of the grass, and let's say, the grass itself is kind of like this color. Well, where these two colors interact, where you're going to get kind of some bounce light into there, you're going to have these two things kind of merging, and you're going to get that this color is altering this, maybe across this whole surface, but more so at the bottom. And then you might have, so that's kind of your top to bottom transition, but then you have the front to back transition, right? So you have what's going on here to here is going to be a little different based on maybe atmosphere. Maybe this is like a 40-foot span that goes across here. When you've got some atmospheric perspective shifting the value and tone here versus what's happening here on the foreground, and then maybe up here also you have like, it's like a garden wall or whatever, and maybe up here you have a bunch of like red shrubs, and some of the red and the rust colors are like bouncing into this. So you have these interactions, and that's what makes something feel realistic, right? And that's why all these little color shifts and tones that are happening here are representing what I'm seeing here. And that's why this, which is a really simple drawing, if you think about what does John Harris do in this picture, it's basically just a rectangle, right? That's broken. And then you have a little derelict ship just kind of limping by, right? And you've got this debris or smoke or whatever coming off of it. That's the whole design. So simple, right? But it's done with beautiful blending. The background is interesting. You've got these dark tones in the bottom that create a great backdrop for the pieces of this ship or structure to fall apart into. You see the nice contrast there. And then that's all it is. So one thing I love about John Harris is that you don't have to be drawing lanes and lanes of city streets with cars and traffic and all the perfect perspective of all that stuff. No, this is a very simple design, and it's done so beautifully, and it communicates so much feeling that it feels like it's in a world. And so before we get into how his work operates and why it's so impactful to me and how you can use the strategies that he uses to make your work better, I just wanted to start out with this simple thing, which just talked about kind of how we work on creating subtle tonal and temperature shifts going in these 4 directions, and how that will help locate these objects in the spaces to help them feel more grounded. All right, so that's it. That's done. Let's move on to the next thing. Okay, so we just talked about how lighting and tone and the color and value information on structures helps locate those structures within the world and make them really feel like they're there. The other thing I want to talk about is just the placement of those structures. And so if we have, like looking at this one, right? I've just sketched this out. It's just a sphere, a diagonal, a rectangle with these receding lines going here. And what that creates is this very simple composition, very simple design, doesn't require a lot of drawing, doesn't require a lot of like perspective planning or measurements or anything like that. It's a very sparse, very elegant, very minimalistic composition. And that composition is very evocative. So I love his work in this way, and I also love it in the same way with fine artists that work in this way, where they can have very little on the canvas, and it feels like a lot, and it expresses a lot, even though there isn't really a lot there. And we're going to talk about how he does that and why he does that and how we can try to do that a little bit. But one last thing before we do that, I want to do one little experiment in ship drawing, because I just don't do a lot of that. And then after that, we're going to go right into a piece that's inspired by John Harris. And that's where we get to the really fun part. So let's get to it. Here we are, line and shape. We call it ship shape. This is where we're going to draw a ship in the style of John Harris. So like I said before, I don't do a lot of ship design. I usually do more figurative work, but I love this kind of stuff. Love science fiction, love fantasy art, love all this stuff. And the most important thing is to love learning, right? So it doesn't matter what we're doing, doesn't matter what the subject is, we just kind of find our way into it and get excited about it. Chalk pastels is still what we're using here. Rebelle has a lot of great default brushes for that, but it's super easy to go in the brush creator, you can just change the brush head, you can change the texture, you can change the grain, you can change all kinds of things that are literally at the click of a button, just like you see here, and they work really well. So I just made a brush. In the time it took me to say brush creator, the brush was made, and the brushes work really well, the default ones, but for those of us that paint a lot, we probably have, and you're probably the same way, like you have a very distinct feel you want from your brush. And sometimes it's hard to get that from the default brushes, even if there's a lot of variety there. So I would just encourage you to jump into the brush creator and take a look. As far as the workflow here and the process, all I'm doing is keeping the kind of the visual language of John Harris in my head as I'm doodling. But I can't help but, as I doodle, think about Star Wars and the things that are really formative for me. I love Star Wars, love X-Wings, stuff like that. So whenever I think about drawing sci-fi, you can see the nose shape a little bit and the cockpit shape even a little bit. It just starts to creep in there, like the X-Wing design or whatever. So forgive that. It's just more about me just doodling. I think before I do my final drawings a lot of the time, and I know you don't always have time like this when you're working with clients, but if you do have time, it's nice to say, give yourself 10 or 15 minutes to just warm up, and doodle and sketch and be playful and try things out. And that's what I'm doing here. So the design here isn't great and the execution isn't great and it's not supposed to be highly technical. It's just a way of testing out how to use the straight line tool, that nice little key command modifier, and how to start thinking about these different planar surfaces and how to make sure that I have left to right, top to bottom gradient shifts on those so that they look kind of in situ, like they belong within the lighting situation in that scene, and that it all makes sense. So yeah, and then I love just drawing with this straight edge like modifier, because it lets me create those panels that you would see like in the original Star Wars, like on the X-Wings and stuff. I thought that was really fun. And you could get as detailed as you want with this and be as careful as you want with it, but this is for me just doodling. And I get a lot of mileage out of just doodling. So I hope that works for you too. As we come to the close of this little exercise, I just wanted to remind you that where we're headed is to do a little undersketch and then to do a final illustration inspired by John Harris. And that's what we're here for. So I think for that one, I'm going to use oil paint, but for all the prelim, I just wanted to use pastels. I just think that's fun to look at and helps me expand too, because I don't use a lot of the oil pastels here. One more thing is I just added a new layer here. So I liked the paint on the wing, but I wanted it to feel more three-dimensional. So I changed the blend mode here to overlay, and then I just paint some light, paint some dark, paint some warm, paint some cool, and help give that wing a little bit more of the aerodynamics of a real wing, letting the light bend around it. So onward and upward, we're going to find the design now. Here I take a handful of sketches that I did for the main drawing of this tutorial, and I just wanted to show you that there's a lot of different ways of looking at this. So here's one sketch, and I do these incredibly loosely just to kind of be obnoxiously bad on purpose, because I think a lot of times people do their kind of composition or design sketches and they're very careful about it, and I love that. But for a tutorial like this, I want to embrace the speed and embrace the just kind of action of painting. So I chose this one, and I did a little color study beforehand based on this reference photo. I think I just wanted to make sure it would kind of work before I went ahead and did a whole tutorial on it. But here's a kind of an interesting method that you can follow as you start to add the value, the local color here. Here's an oil painting by an artist that is of a woman, just with this very blue background with a nice gradient. it has some violets and it has some skin tones and it has a little bit of red here and there and some brown. And I just thought it would be a really perfect test case to use this image for the color palette for the John Harris painting. And I do this a lot where, like, if I'm on social media or if I'm on Pinterest or I'm on YouTube or I'm on wherever and I see something, whether it's a still frame or a video, I will screen cap it or I'll screenshot it or I'll download it or whatever it is, because if I see some colors and the color harmonies or relationships that I like, I'm going to use it. I have whole folders on my computer that are full of images, and I don't really even sort them. I just sort them by month that I found them, so that what naturally happened is I create these sort of like aesthetic clusters of the kind of images that are interesting to me at a various, like at various moments in history. And so like I remember what those moments are, and especially if you open up the folder and you see this kind of cohesive collection, I literally just named them like November 23 or January 2024 or whatever. And then I just have a cluster of images in there. And anything I find online is just saved in those files. And that's where this image came from. And so when I was thinking, gosh, I need a like a color scheme for today's painting, I just opened up that folder. I was like, oh, this is perfect. And we go. And you can see here, what I'm doing is I did the underpainting, like I just did the first layer of the painting, and then I created a new layer that's a soft light blend mode layer, and I'm painting the light and the shadow into the scene. I really wanted to exaggerate the debris and the fog and the atmosphere. It's not something you typically think about when you think like, oh, I'm going to do a space-based painting. You think no atmosphere, no air, the void of space, the blackness of space. But John Harris takes that in a different direction, and he puts traditional atmospheric painting techniques into the space paintings, right? Into these illustrations of these other worlds. And it's one of the ways in which his goal of making the worlds feel like whole and approachable and intelligible. That's one of the techniques he uses to do that, right? Like the cold harshness of space is hard to really grasp, but the way he paints it, it's full of color, it's full of atmosphere, it's full of habitation, and there's things going on. There's travel and transport and work and construction and things failing and rising, and all of that is happening in these big, beautiful worlds that John Harris paints. Now, I think when you listen to him talk, and if you ever watch any of his YouTube interviews, he talks about needing to create some sort of something within the scene that the viewer can grab onto, as in they can empathize with, they can connect with, they can feel themselves kind of stepping into the world of through that lens, whether that's through the lens of something that's proportionally similar to what we have. Like maybe you've got this epic scene like this, but down on the bottom you have, a guy pumping gas into his spaceship or whatever. Whether or not that's a realistic fuel source, just something along those lines is kind of what he's talking about as a way of like creating a familiarity within the foreign nature of these deep space images. And so that was kind of the big question for me as I was working through this. I loved painting the atmosphere. I loved painting this scene with this big moon with these rings around it that almost have like their ice rings or dust rings. They're like almost shedding them, and the debris is like falling everywhere, and the light is pooling through it, and it's it starts to create this almost like waterfall of debris in the background, and I think it's just really cool to look at. And then I thought, well, maybe I can I've got the atmosphere down, but how do I create some of that familiarity? So I just abandoned ship on my original sketch and got rid of the literal ship in the air, in the space, and I decided instead to create like a near and a far and a further version of these little triangular kind of wedge ships. And that was my solution for creating something that has a familiarity to it. Also, I wanted to go and push the colors just a little bit because I felt like my reference picture had more beautiful color in it than mine, and I wanted to exaggerate the color just a little bit. So I put some pinks and some peaches in the bottom, and then I put some blues and some greens in the top, and it just added a little more lavender, it added a little more spatial depth. And then I just feel like it was really important also to find some brushes that, whether they were the scatter brushes or the grunge brushes or whatever, to create a little bit of that debris and texture in the background. I really, really, really am fond of that. I also wanted to, I guess, echo some of the shedding of the debris, almost like it's falling with gravity, on the smoke or steam or material coming out of the back of this ship that's kind of flying past the structure. And I think that part works pretty well, and it's starting to come together. So we have this kind of two-step thing going on. We have, like, in the nearer ground, we have this ship kind of flying in out of top right, and its debris, it's, whatever is coming out of its engine is like falling down, along with the background where the rings and the light, it seems to be pooling down. And then the sky itself, the space itself, is full of atmosphere and texture, and there's little, twinkling stars out there, but it's also just this big feeling, big acting, kind of alive space. And then I wanted to paint these little windows in what was obviously like some kind of bizarre habitation. And I didn't know if this structure is like floating in space or if it's these little like spires. It's like mounted on something on the planet's surface, but it didn't really matter. What mattered was that there's some oddity to the design, a uniqueness to the design to make it feel otherworldly, but that you could still see that there were windows, which would help you understand not only the scale but also the purpose of those buildings a little bit. And then I wanted to also make sure that once that little sector was painted a little bit better, that I get some time on the foreground, because this ship here in the foreground, it doesn't really look enough like the one that's flying up near the moon, and it needs to. And then everything was just couched in darkness, and I don't really feel like that fits the vibe I was going for. So you can see here, I'm just kind of pushing the background a little bit more, kind of painting my way toward that foreground area, which is a big kind of unknown problem right now. I've got to solve it still. And I have some ideas about just better value and making the light look a little bit more real. But I really also want to make the figures come to life, because looking again at that kind of, where can I tie in some familiarity? How can I make this epic, huge sci-fi spectrum of experience? How can I bring it down in a way that it can still feel big, but it can also feel like something that's intelligible to me? So I put a further ship in the background there, cleaned up the main ship in the sky. Then I wanted to come up here and just get some work done on these little figures. So they weren't just like little clothespin silhouettes, but they actually had a purpose. They had maybe a suit. They had maybe jobs, and maybe, just seemed like it needed that. So here we have a little trio of figures here wearing bright yellow. And then I thought it'd be nice to figure out, once they're kind of couched there, how do I make it look like they're in a place that they belong? So I wanted to create a little bit of depth, almost like an approach that you would take onto that maybe runway. And then I wanted to paint, even some yellow lines to kind of just suggest something familiar there. And then I'll put a big, maybe turret on a domed structure in the back, as though maybe this is something that needs to be guarded or whatever. A little bit of detail on the wings and a little bit of detail on the engines to just kind of blend things in a little bit. But overall, I just feel like this was a really fun painting, and I learned a lot from the Harris style. I learned some different ways to think about painting space. I learned a lot about thinking about painting ship design. I learned about creating simple compositions that suggest a much bigger world, a much bigger relationship to a much bigger things. And I just had a lot of fun appropriating the color scheme from this beautiful painting. And I hope you guys enjoy. I certainly did, and thank you so much for the opportunity to draw and paint with you guys. Here's the final outcome with the color and the atmosphere and the depth and the otherworldly ships and actions and interactions. And thank you so much for the time to be inspired together. And that was a lot of fun for me. So let's get on to the next artist, and I think you guys are going to have a blast with that as well.